very good morning to you and welcome to Morning Express. My name is Trix Ingada. Today on the show, we shall be focusing on the very latest in news and updates from the region and internationally. We are going to take a look at what's making headlines in the local papers as well as the international agencies, what they're prioritizing, and also have special guests help us analyze some of these stories. And of course, do stay tuned for that and much more. To kick us off, let's take a look at what's making headlines on the international front. And as per usual, we love to start with the Pearl of Africa. Let's take a look at what's making headlines on the Daily Monitor. As we prepare the Daily Monitor for you, we have the New Times. That is from Rwanda right there, as you can see. And let's just scroll down and see what Rwanda's leading daily is telling us this morning. Kagame reiterates Rwanda's commitment to global peace operations. He has reiterated Rwanda's commitment to global peace operations. This comes hot on the heels of some very interesting developments as far as the genocide in Rwanda is concerned, with the arrest of Paul Rusesabagina, who was later on convicted for crimes that he was of course said to be a part of. Also, we are told on the Rwanda Times, Rwanda steps up a focus on hydroponic farming, that is farming minus soil, and it's done in a special way, and of course that seems to be working out for them. Also, delayed reporting, evidence tampered, and of course that has to do with crime, and land costs soar in secondary cities. Also, we are told Mpunga holds vaccine progress as Rwanda records zero COVID infections. That's very good for that small East African country. Let's move on to the next paper and see what is making headlines this morning. We are having for you the CNN. Now, this morning they're telling us China to test thousands of Wuhan blood samples. We do know Wuhan has infamously been the epicenter in the beginning and the source, or rather the origins of the coronavirus infections that have spread to the world over. And of course, this is quite apt that they would be testing blood samples, of course, to get to the bottom of those infections and get the status quo at the moment. Previously, a few months ago, there were reports of a spike in coronavirus infections in that area, and of course, that activity seems quite just. Now, moving on. We're told global supply chain nightmare is about to get worse. Find out why that is happening. Also, Gabi Pato cause of death has been established as strangulation. That young lady pictured there had been missing for a while, and later on, after a search and a manhunt for her then boyfriend, of course, revealed his whereabouts and of course her body. And now they are telling us what caused her death after videos were circulating of her looking troubled on social media. Also, we are told these 4 Chinese real estate developers are already in trouble, and that has to do with debt. Apparently, they're struggling to pay off debt that they have taken, of course, for the purpose of doing business. That's what the CNN is leading with this morning. And then we have right there, as you can see there, the Citizen. That is from This is Rwanda today, actually. Back to Rwanda. We're told government now mulls a levy on banned single-use plastic products. Now, of course, it's not easy fit for any country to, transition as Kenya did, and now they're trying to look at it and how they can work that out. That is Rwanda. That has followed hot on the heels of Kenya when it comes to trying to conserve the environment. Also, a study shows COVID-19 survivors at higher risk of suffering heart failure. Find out why. Some of the long-term effects of the coronavirus are being put to the fore in that, paper. Also, Mozambique forces kill opposition rebel leader, and over 60,000 learners to repeat in line with ministry directive. And of course, that has to do with the complications caused by the coronavirus that meant that learning will not go on in Rwanda as usual. Similar situations have unfolded here in Kenya, and that, of course, is one of the many results of the pandemic. Also, vaccine prevents severe COVID even from Delta. That's another reason for you to get yourself vaccinated, as we're being told by the Rwanda Today. Take a look at what's making headlines internationally, but also we have our local dailies here. And just to give you a sneak peek of what's making headlines in the local news, Somalia is taking center stage, and of course, that is one of the stories that are making headlines this morning. The Standard newspaper is telling us that Somalia walks out of ICJ without claimed territory. Also, we are told MP's new plan to cut down powers of the DP, and of course, this is just one of the many stories surrounding the Deputy President and his political ambitions, and of course, what his opponents are doing and feel is right in terms of his state as the Deputy President of the country. House Committee wants the head of state to have power to hire and fire future Deputy Presidents and to avoid a repeat of the current standoff between the President, Uhuru Kenyatta, and his Deputy, William Ruto. And we have details right there that we are going to analyze later on. They're telling us all about it in the Standard. Also giving us details on what's happening with Raila Odinga. Win or lose, I will accept. That's what he's saying, a very noble statement right there, given the history of this country and the politics that we do know can get a bit messy. Also, the Daily Nation this morning is leading with "To an Inch, Kenya rejects a C verdict," and this is right, of course, one of the biggest stories that are making headlines these days, and of course yesterday was quite pivotal in this case. The next stop, with the International Court of Justice siding with Somalia, Kenya could lodge a protest with the United Nations Security Council and resort to a diplomatic offensive. And they're also telling us to stop implementation. Rather, Kenya will seek to stop implementation of the judgment or simply defy and refuse to comply with any orders of the court. And this is a special coverage that's happening not just on the Daily Nation but also on the other papers. The Standard is telling us more about that as well. And we also have the Business Daily before us this morning. They're telling us MPs increase foreign travel spend 14 times. Find out why. That is, of course, something that not everyone will be happy with, given the country is not doing very well when it comes to expenditure and the economy. And we are expecting to be joined here at the Standard Media Group headquarters with Professor Alfred Omenya, governance expert. Also, Bunyasi Sakwa Nambale, Member of Parliament, who is also an economist, and we also have Dr. Exen Iraki, who is an economist. They're going to be joining us to discuss these stories and the others that are making headlines in the dailies and, of course, on TV. Now, let's start off with this story. An already frosty relationship between Kenya and Somalia is headed for worse times after the International Court of Justice allowed Somalia's claim over territories in the Indian Ocean previously under Kenyan control. The judgment, delivered by a 15-judge bench at The Hague, follows a 7-year court battle between the two nations after Somalia sued Kenya over the maritime space and said to be rich in oil and aquatic life. Our senior political affairs reporter Murimi Mwangi starts our show with that story.
Welcome. For 7 years now, Kenya and the Federal Republic of Somalia have been locked in a vicious battle for control of this contentious 65,000 square miles of maritime space in the Indian Ocean that saw Somalia sue Kenya at the Hague-based International Court of Justice in 2014.
The court has set high...
The 14-judge bench finally giving a verdict.
The court, 1, unanimously finds that there is no agreed maritime boundary between the Federal Republic of Somalia and the Republic of Kenya that follows the parallel of latitude described in paragraph 35 above.
In the dispute, Kenya had maintained that the maritime boundary between the two nations stretched seawards in a horizontal line, parallel to the latitude from the point of intersection of the two countries' physical boundary, a claim Kenya consistently supported with documents it had filed with the United Nations agencies and which it claimed Somalia had ratified, a position refuted by Somalia. Somalia, instead claiming its maritime borderline with Kenya ought to have stretched seawards in a straight line guided by Somalia's physical borderline with Kenya. In its findings, the ICJ rejected Kenya's position, instead ruling in Somalia's favor but with a slight adjustment of the boundary northwards from Somalia's initial claim.
By 10 votes to 4, decides that from the end of the boundary in the territorial sea, point A, the single maritime boundary delimiting the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf up to 200 nautical miles between the Federal Republic of Somalia and the Republic of Kenya follows the geodetic line starting with azimuth 114 degrees until it reaches the 200 nautical mile limit. The consequence of the court's judgment is that the maritime boundary has now been delimited between the parties.
Kenya had brought to the court's attention the terror threats posed by Somalia's collapsed state, arguing that an alteration of the boundary, as claimed by Somalia, would bring the security threat closer to Kenya and pose a greater danger to the Horn of Africa and the globe. Kenya had already indicated it would not recognize the court finding.
The court cannot conclude that the activities carried out by Kenya in the disputed area jeopardized or hampered the reaching of a final agreement on the delimitation of the maritime boundary in violation of Article 74, Paragraph 3, or Article 83, Paragraph 3 of UNCLOS.
Mambo ya ardhi yetu, watu kujaribu kuchukua, kutumia makoti ya dunia, kuchangia kuporomosha nchi yetu. Ni vizuri tushikane wakati kama huu mgumu, tunashikana. Na tumesema hakuna hata inchi moja hata ya kinjiko ya Kenya taenda mahali.
And the Hague finding no doubt escalates the mistrust, tension and standoff between Kenya and Somalia as the International Court of Justice pushes for enforcement of its verdict. Murimi Mwangi, KTN News.
All right, and that is the hottest topic. When you take a look at the papers this morning, it's all about the Kenya-Somalia maritime dispute and the fallout that has, of course, preceded it. Now, with us, like I said earlier on, is Professor Alfred Omenya, a governance expert. We have Sakwa Bunyasi, who is the Nambale Member of Parliament, as well as an economist. And we have senior economist Dr. Exen Iraki with me here in studio. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us this morning. Now, let's just first start off by contextualizing this particular issue. Dr. Iraki, what could you give us a brief history and the genesis of all this, and of course, what's more important, what the stakes are here?
I'm looking at a map of the Kenyan-Somali coast.
Yes, it's on the front page of the Daily Nation.
And I'm seeing a triangle.
Yeah.
And that takes me back maybe 40 years or so, when I was being taught how to calculate the area of a triangle. So this one, I can calculate and get you the mileage or the square kilometers. This is. It's about 100,000 square kilometers.
Okay.
That's a lot of land.
Yes.
If you consider the amount of land you own and the amount of land that I own or any other person, it's a lot of land.
Yes.
But I think the issue is, this is the sea. And in the last 100 years or so, we have discovered that there's a lot of minerals under the water.
Okay.
That could be oil, or that could be gas. So the reason why this verdict is very contentious is not so much because Somalia is losing or Kenya is losing.
Yes.
It's because of the minerals under the water.
Otherwise, there wouldn't be too much fuss about it.
There would be too much fuss about it. So about some years ago, Kenya drew that line parallel or attitude. And that is, if you look at the map of Kenya, it ends at an angle.
Yes.
If you look at the land map, the border ends at an angle. So you can draw it down or parallel. So there's a triangle there that is contentious. And I think we need Solomonic wisdom to decide who should take that land or who should take that piece of land.
True.
So in my opinion, Kenya and Somalia have been fighting. If you remember the last 20 years or the last 10 years, the Kenyan troops have been Somali because of Shabab and so on. So I think this is now adding salt to injury. And I think the two countries should sit and talk to each other. Indeed. Because whether we want or not, we shall always be neighbors.
Absolutely. And Honorable Bunyasi, when you look at this triangle that Mr. Iraki is pointing out, it's quite interesting because it could go either way. So that Solomonic wisdom, perhaps you could give us a bit of that. How would you hope this to unfold if we are to resolve it amicably, given that there are resources that both countries want to explore?
Thank you very much, Trix. First of all, in disputes of this kind, it's really no logical or rational, unless there had been colonization or footprints left there. But this is the sea. You don't have that. I think it's all going to be a negotiated agreement that you can't. None of them can have exactly what they wanted, right? And that they must agree on something. It's going to be a negotiated agreement depending on just on the amount of or to call it trust, that can be brought around the table, or the concerns for the outcomes and consequences of not agreeing on this. First of all, this is going to become a hotspot, you can bet. I can say with some little element of trepidation on saying it, but that the Republic of Somalia has been at war with itself and with neighbors since its creation, since Kenya's creation. And this certainly is going to provide what would appear like a very valid excuse for their side and for Kenya, essentially to get at war there. I really think that, and I don't know the law on this one, but I would have thought that Kenya's representation in the court would have been very helpful, if anything but to give our position. But I'm not a lawyer. All I know is that in ordinary courts, if you don't show up, you run a risk of getting judgment against you without any form of redress. So there must be some logical reason or legal reason why this happened. I don't think it was a good idea personally, at least judging by the outcome.
Now, Professor Menya, as far as diplomacy is concerned, and given the history that Kenya and Somalia have concerned, we cannot extricate ourselves from each other. We intermingle economically. We have people from Somalia, refugees in Kenya. We have Kenyans with interest in Somalia. At the same time, there's a war that's ongoing on, like Dr. Exen Iraki put it. And then at the same time, we have this piece of land that we both want because of what it means in terms of resources. How badly is it? How badly do we need these resources? What difference would they make? And of course, what's the possibility of coming up with an amicable resolution that is not as acrimonious as what we are seeing in the papers this morning?
Yeah, thanks. This is a very interesting issue and a very interesting debate, and it's been going on for quite some time. Kenya and Somali engaging on the disputed land. We know at the core of it is actually around the resources that Prof. Iraki has highlighted there. But then, of course, one must also understand both the issue of boundaries and also the issue of ICJ as having a political dimension. Yes, the conversations with Kenya and Somalia has been going on for a bit of time. Of course, Kenyan forces are in Somalia as part of the UN forces there. And it's interesting that it was when Somalia was facing its election that the team from Somalia decided then to sue Kenya at ICJ. So that brought in a very strong political angle. And that is a bit of my worry on this. The way ICJ has, of course, done the judgment is to award Somali a significant portion of the land and not agree fully, of course, also award Kenya, a bit of that particular triangle in dispute.
Right.
But then, of course, the question is, would the countries actually adhere to that judgment? The answer is no, and it is because it's political. And this is not new. ICJ has made so many judgments on boundaries, including some binding the US that have been in place for almost 50, 60 years, and nobody has adhered to those. And
sorry to interrupt you on that. Then what's the point of the ICJ if countries keep going against some of these rulings? And why can't they, what is it about the ICJ that, let's compare it to the ICC, that makes it less effective when it comes to some of these rulings?
Just as I was finishing the point, I think some of these things must be dealt with through the spaces that they need to. And I think they're more political, and we do have those particular spaces within the African Union, within the UN and so on, to deal with them, as opposed to looking at them as purely technical legal issues. And we also know that within the countries themselves, the countries themselves look at this from a political perspective.
Yes.
You can already see Kenyan politicians starting to ram up support about sovereignty of the country and not losing an inch of the land. And we know this is very popular around elections, and Somalis are doing the same. The problem is that if this escalates, then in fact you may actually have a possibility of countries going to war around issues of sovereignty, and some of this could come from very small matters as a triangle that could have been dealt with and resolved amicably Yes, and very soon this will also escalate to other issues. People would start questioning colonial borders and starting to ask, why should we actually make reference to agreements that were done in the 1880s and early 90s while we are actually sovereign states now? And then, of course, if you politicize that further, people would look at ICJ then as an extension of colonization of Africa, and that has happened before, when we had other cases in Kenya, although not around the boundary.
Right, absolutely. Now, UN court has sided with Somalia in the ocean border row with Kenya. Dr. Exen, what now, given Kenya's stance of not even 1 inch?
I think when you bring an issue of borders, particularly during the polls time,
yes,
you expect a lot of emotions to be evoked. So Kenya is not going to just start and say that we accept the verdict. But the fact that the UN and other international bodies are getting into this is very good, because I think we have somebody who is neutral, somebody who can be an arbitrator. But I still believe that the best way for a wife and a husband to solve their issues is not to call neighbors, but to sit and talk.
True.
So since Somalia is our neighbor, we can agree what UN and other bodies are going to say. But I think the most important thing is we sit together with Somalis. They are our neighbors. They have always been our neighbors. Some of the Somalis from Somalia live here. And there's no reason why we cannot start talking together. In fact, I have even a more radical solution. Somalia should join the East African community so that we don't just see the political part of this issue, but the economic part of it.
Yes.
I see I see a peaceful Somali as a very good market.
Right.
So let's sit together as neighbors, talk. This is not going anywhere. We can even cut it into two. This is my opinion.
That's what I was going to. Why not just split it in two, and everyone can get their piece.
And the fish don't know which is Somali side and which is the Kenyan side.
That is so true. Now, speaking of splitting it in two, it's very interesting that's the suggestion here. You've mentioned the East African community. If there are trade recommendations or proposals of how the East African nations should operate, when Somalia joins if Somalia joins the East African community, Honorable Bunyasi Sakwa, do you think then that would be a possible solution? Are there trade, let me just call them laws or rules that could actually help in figuring this out? Or is there a possibility of the two countries exploiting the resources underneath the sea in a way or with agreements that will help them both benefit?
There are various options, but one most practical one is the one Professor Iraqi suggested.
Yes.
Woo them into East Africa, and as you become trade partners, trade is a powerful tool for fostering friendships, relatively speaking, and it might ease off the extremes that tend to occur, and perhaps they could begin occurring on both sides. But so far, Somalia has been at the forefront of that. That might go one way. I think the other way would be that since the fight is about resources, but nobody talks about them, everybody knows that's the reason.
The deal,
yes, so it might be that in the negotiations that I mentioned at the beginning, that the issue of resources become the elephant on the table and begin to become the focus of such a discussion, so that the exploitation of resources can follow a formula or a system which is shared in some way or another, either joint exploitation, joint management of resources. We can get arrangements that would probably be very helpful, both for the ecology of the place, but also for maritime economy in the area. I'm told it's very huge, so it can't be something that one country will let another have.
Yeah.
So I do really hope that beginning with the suggestion of Professor Iraqi that you can probably woo them into the community, knowing that in fact they're a neighbor, perhaps also wanting to come in someday, we can extend that and see which other ways then we can now bring the resource question with the question under negotiation.
Now, Professor Menya, there's a very interesting assertion here in the Daily Nation that talks about how, or rather asserts this is how Kenya bungled this particular case. They say in a move that cooked Kenya's good, the Nairobi government agreed to participate in the ICJ case. Had Kenya refused to recognize the ICJ's jurisdiction at the time, the case would likely not have proceeded. On Tuesday, and of course leading to the defeat for Nairobi, and Kenya would successfully seek to have the case adjourned 3 times. Is that correct?
That is actually correct. Yeah, Kenya, we need to take a position on ICJ, and we know that Kenya had an intention of withdrawing from ICJ when we had the issue of crimes against humanity involving the president and the prime minister, and in fact, Kenya even led other African countries in those particular considerations, and there was a process that was going to take, I think, a year plus, a couple of years to withdraw from the ICJ. Once the cases collapsed, that process was never followed. And Kenya then remained part of ICJ. Yeah. I think from a strategic point of view, we must actually ask ourselves why a number of countries, for example, the US, are not part of the ICJ. And we need to take a position whether we want to be part of ICJ. And then, of course, if that's the case, it means that rulings such as this then become binding, or we are not part of ICJ at all, so that we really do not have to adhere to the rulings of ICJ. And when it comes to matters like this, then we could actually seek other mechanisms outside of the ICJ. So here we are, there's a ruling, we are members of ICJ. We cannot just ignore the ruling, because I mean we are members, but of course, having said that, the ICJ itself has suggested that there need to be amicable solutions to this, and Prof. Iraqi there just highlighted, and Sakwaya just highlighted that these are times for Solomonic wisdom. I just want to add on to that that actually there could be other mechanisms of governing, joint governing of such territories, but again, those sort of mechanisms would never really come from a court. They never come from a court of law. They would come from political spaces, such as the East African Community or the African Union, and so on, where the warring partners would actually sit on the table and see the best way of looking at this. And again, to use Iraqi's example of a husband and wife, I always tell people that by the time you go to a court of law to resolve your domestic issues, you have no marriage. You need to sit down.
Things have fallen apart.
Exactly, you need to sit down and decide. But even after the court decides, still you need to sit down, because there are what the lawyers call issues. How do you deal with the children? Who visits when? What happens to the in-laws and so on.
You're introducing
so either way, my point is that either way, we still must sit with Somali. We must still find mechanisms of resolving this issue. Of course, the court's verdict is not final, but of course, Kenya's position is complicated because we are members of the court.
Indeed. Now, speaking of the political decisions, the president of Somalia has come out in a statement on the same note. Somalian President Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo on Tuesday evening welcomed the International Court of Justice ruling of the maritime dispute with Kenya. Farmajo says the Somali government accepts the court's decision and urged Kenya to do the same. In a televised address, a seemingly nationalistic Farmajo accused Kenya of meddling with Somali's internal affairs by mobilizing political groups in Nairobi in order to create an atmosphere of chaos and political instability in the Horn of Africa, country that would ultimately lead to the withdrawal of the case from the ICJ. The Somali leader further claimed that the Kenyan government resorted to direct violation of Somali's sovereignty by spending enormous time and resources in a campaign to politically isolate them. What is your reaction to that?
The Somali president is actually being statesman.
Yeah.
He's trying to show that we respect the international arbitration, we respect the international institutions, and by extension, Kenya should do that. But the problem is that Kenya had already said we are withdrawing from ICJ.
Yeah.
So it's very hard for Kenya to follow a verdict that was made by institution that we purport not to support.
Yes.
So it's going to become a bit more complicated because you are not in an institution, but you're supposed to follow the verdict of that institution.
Right. Honorable Bunyasi, your reaction to that statement by the president?
The president's statement is really a very broad spectrum, and it's covering a whole gamut of things. The bottom line is that there are going to be claims, perhaps even wild claims about interference.
Yeah.
And as you know, a large part of Somalia Republic leadership resides in Nairobi, or rather has close links in and out of Nairobi.
Very true.
So I guess each time they have a coffee get-together in the evening, it will be taken as a plan against mother country or something. And they have a very intricate mosaic of demographic factors. So it's going to be quite complicated. What I see here is that given the tendency that we witnessed right from the shifter wars at the beginning of this republic, that we are going to, each time there's going to be tension in Somalia of any kind, I think this boundary issue, the maritime boundary issue, will probably be invoked when they want to annoy Kenya, irritate Kenya, and so on.
Yes, yes.
When I heard C.S. Munya saying that not an inch should go, not a spoon, I guess that's how you say, that's what you should say when you're in a dispute of this kind.
Yes.
But quite apart from Kenya not being in court, I did not sense that there was any robust domestic discussion of an issue of that kind to get the nation behind them. This is something that will lead to war. There's no question about it.
And Honorable Bunyasi, what would the nation, would that do for this whole issue, the nation getting behind it?
It would help the Kenyan side, I think, negotiate more robustly.
Yeah.
The Somalis are also watching. They would feel that there is a big push in Kenya among the ordinary public, because Somalia is going to sell itself as the one that is aggrieved, and it is going to use the ICJ judgment and so on.
Right.
Out here, I don't know, on the streets of Nairobi, if you question 100 people from my professors who are here, how many would even know anything about that and so on. And this is important. It's going to commit resources.
Yes, yes.
It's going to change our foreign policy. It's going to be untenable for Kenya to maintain, to be part of AMISOM in Somalia. With this, we'll be putting our soldiers, I'm not a soldier, I've never been, in direct danger. It has very many implications.
This is true. This is true. And like I've said earlier on, it's very difficult to extricate Somalia and Kenya. We are sort of some siblings in a way. So much gets in, we intermingle in so many areas.
Absolutely.
And now, Professor Omenya, the president of Somalia has said that Kenya is interfering in Somalia's internal affairs. That's not the first time we're hearing that coming out of Somalia. What is your reaction to that?
Well, I mean, the president's statement is very unfortunate. Let me just say that. And as Honorable Bunyasi has highlighted, I mean, Kenya and Somalia joined at the hip. We know that it is impossible to separate Kenya from Somalia because of the people, not because of the border. We have a lot of Somalis in Kenya. I've spent a lot of time, in fact, I spend a lot of time in the town of Mandera even now. And you can see that even with borders closed, the Somalis and the Kenyans and the Ethiopians in that border town, operate like there is no closure.
Absolutely,
the Somalis come by the matatus and so on, because these people are relatives.
Yes.
Yeah, so we have a huge number of Somalis in Kenya. We have a lot of course, I mean, quite a number of Somalis in Somalia, and they're the same people. And whether we like it or not, Somali's problem is intricately linked with ours. It is very, very interesting that eventually Kenya, through AMISOM, got into Somali to ensure that Somali stabilizes, because a stable Somali is good for Kenya. And now it's very, very unfortunate that through this ruling and the statement that Farmajo is making there, and Farmajo, let me just declare him a warlord and somebody who's not really good for leadership at that particular level. Escalating this does not help at all. And I don't believe that a hostile Kenya would actually help a collapsed Somali, get the governance issues on track. In fact, the reason why we are even talking about Somalia, the reason why we are even being sued, is because of the stability that Kenya has put in Somalia. That's the reason why some of these jokers would even find the resources to go and sue us at The Hague.
Okay.
And I think it is very, very important. It's very, very important for Somalia and Farmajo and his team to forget about their warlordism and become leaders That is what this calls for.
Right.
And get the Kenyan leadership and get the Kenyan people and the Somali people and realize that we do have a common interest and resolve this matter amicably.
Okay, Professor Menya, let's hear what you have to say about the Kenyans' reaction to this. Now, Kenya on Friday, through Foreign Affairs PS Macharia Kamau, said it would reject in totality the ICJ decision on maritime border row that largely favored Somalia. While addressing a media briefing at the United Nations headquarters in New York on Tuesday, President Kenyatta said he would issue a comprehensive report on the ruling that saw Kenya's long-held position of delineation along a parallel of latitude being rejected by the International Court of Justice. That's Kenyan side of it. Let's listen in.
Kenya has maintained, even before Somalia filed the current case, that any dispute between the two countries regarding their maritime boundary should be resolved through amicable negotiations. In fact, in 2009, the two countries entered into an agreement on how and when to amicably address matters concerning the maritime boundary. Kenya reiterated this position when Somalia filed the case at the International Court of Justice. Surprisingly, the court assumed jurisdiction where it had none by effectively ignoring Kenya's 1965 reservation that excluded disputes such as the present one from the court's jurisdiction. Ironically, while the court declared our 2009 agreement with Somalia on how and when to address matters concerning the maritime boundary valid, it proceeded to ignore the same nonetheless. The first threat to Kenya's territorial integrity was overt and direct. That happened during the Shifter War of 1967-1969.
Wow, now we're taking it back to the Shifter War. I mean, that's a while back, but of course, at this time, it's a little bit of chest thumping that is involved here. Dr. Exen, what's your reaction to that, evoking those yesteryears where Kenya and Somalia had disputes?
I was actually surprised that we can now start evoking the issues of Shifter War, 1967-69. But in such a dispute, history is always a very good way, a very good well to mine some weapons or some emotions.
Yes.
But if now you start bringing in the issue of shifter, you make the dispute even more complex.
Yes, yes.
And I can even make the debate even more complex. If you remember when Afghanistan fell about 1 month ago to the Taliban, some militants in Somalia were celebrating. So beyond the two governments that are disputing, we also have the issue of terrorism. We have the issue of warlords. We have the issue of other people who don't like Kenya.
Yeah.
And that's why this dispute should be looked at in a very sober way, not just through chest pumping. Because there are some elements within the government or within Somalia who don't like us, who don't like the political settlement, and who are extremists. Indeed. And we must think about those extremists when we come up with this dispute, or when we look at this dispute. Remember, America was in Somalia one time and they withdrew, a superpower. So when we look at this dispute between the two countries, we must not look at it at the national level, but also look at it at the grassroots level. Who are going to suffer? The ordinary people, the people on the streets, the people who have never enjoyed peace in Somalia for the last 20 years or so. And it is time we got peace in Somalia, because the children of Somalia have suffered enough. Now, when we start now going back to history and say, you know, this is shifter, this is what, it is good for political reasons. But we want a practical solution. We want to see the two countries trade more.
Right.
I want to go for a holiday in Somalia. I want, if possible, to buy a beach plot in Kismayo.
Yes.
So that we live like brothers and sisters. But when we start now just something, it is good politically, but not for it. It's not for ordinary person.
Absolutely.
Who we should worry about.
Yeah, Honorable Sako Bunyasi, you mentioned earlier on if you would go out to the street and ask 10 people about what's going on with the maritime dispute, probably they wouldn't know. But then when you invoke the shifter wars and things like that, I'm sure you can get some reactions and emotions. And is it wise for anyone to base their judgment of what's happening on certain disputes and conflicts of many, many decades ago?
Well, fortunately for Kenya, there's a general belief that subjects like history are not important. So you don't need to know anything about what happened the day before yesterday.
Yeah.
Then you are free to do things today that people have been through. I think that, yes, I find, first of all, the ambassador's statement somewhat arrogant, in my view. In diplomatic conversations, I'm sure that his words would slightly be more couched. Kenya believes that there's no merit in that matter, that Kenya has probably an absolute right.
Yes.
That's how it seems to come across. They don't recognize the court itself and so on. But he speaks as if it's a matter in which there would be some appeal. The only process lying ahead under those circumstances is what has just been said, that maybe we get the two countries around the table, maybe with a mediator or something.